Welcome. My name is David Malone. I have the privilege of working at the UN University, which is headquartered in Tokyo. And we meet in Tokyo today with Dr. Emma Rothschild and Dr. Amartya Sen. They are visiting Tokyo in part for a public conversation at UNU this evening on the theme of history and development. And they're kind enough to spend a few minutes with us to reach our viewers online on this theme. And so, Emma, I thought I'd start by asking you, when you think of history and development, what do you think of?
Well, first of all, and this is a direct answer to your question, it's such a pleasure to be back here at the UNU. Actually, my first ever visit to Japan was to the UNU when Sojat Moko, a figure greatly interested in history, was rector. And then I myself had the privilege of being involved in a project called History and Development at UNU wider in the early 1990s. I think history and development has an interesting and complicated relationship to history in general. And one can think of there being almost a dichotomy of history versus economics in terms of development. And the early United Nations saw economic development as being in many ways a repudiation of history. If you think of the 1950s and getting over World War II, getting over what was thought of as the scourge of nationalism, development was going to be purely economic. It meant overthrowing the bonds of history and custom and national prejudice. And that's been a tension which has persisted ever since. I mean, two of the greatest economists who were involved in the UN, T.W. Schultz and W. Arthur Lewis, actually recommended that all these bonds be overthrown, so there'd be a purely economic and purely universal progress towards development. And this was a noble objective in the early 1950s. I think now there's much greater recognition that each part of the world has its own historically inflected way of seeking development. Here in Japan, one would see all around one that the Japanese mode of economic development is profoundly influenced by Japan's historic commitment to education, to health, to aesthetic sense. But I think something remains of that tension between history, which is always tempted by nationalism, and an economic idea of universal progress. And I think that's one reason why, as we think about the UNU's own 40th anniversary this year, the history of the overall UN's ideas of development is itself an absolutely fascinating subject for intellectual history, going right back to the late 1940s and early 1950s, and the attempt to find something which was beyond history and universal in a geographical and temporal sense. So that's an exciting subject for historians to think about now.
Terrific. And I should have mentioned at the outset that you, Emma, of course, are a professor of history at Harvard, but that you've written so much about the Enlightenment, also the history of ideas and economics. And Amartya is a professor of economics and philosophy. So between you, you really span a number of very important disciplines. So on the same topic, Amartya, what comes to your mind?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as Emma said, and for me it's very evocative to be back here. For me, it's back to Tokyo and Japan. I came here first in the late 50s and has been a very big presence in my life. No, I think Emma is right to emphasize the the national characteristics. But there is also another aspect. There is a kind of global commitment that we see in the history of the world, which is very important for development. If you think of development as consisting on one side as economic expansion, removal of wants and deprivation, on the other side as democracy and so on. Let's think of some dates from the past in which Japan, in some of them Japan is very centrally involved. So let me take 4 dates. 604, Constitution of 17 article, Prince Shotoku, a Buddhist prince here, acting as a regent for Princess Sukui, who was in charge there. In the Constitution 17 article, this is 600 years before Magna Carta, discussing why it is important that no monarch should rule without consulting everybody else. So it's important that you have a consultation process. I mean, it's the beginning of what John Stuart Mill and others would think of as being democracy, being government by discussion. Now, the Japanese have a very strong root in that, already in that period, as I mentioned, well before Magna Carta. Then think of another date, height of European Enlightenment, 1776, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations being published. That is a view of development as economic expansion in which the market plays a part, and he is the guru, great guru of explaining how the market works and why. But he's also said one of the reasons why we want economic prosperity is because it raises individual income, but also because it raises revenue in the hands of the government, for the government to do those things which the government alone can do. And he cites in that context education. Now, and he's also concerned about the process of dialogue into such devices as the impartial spectator. What would somebody say if he observed, or he or she observed you doing that? Then take another date, 1868, Meiji Restoration here, and the beginning of a new era for Japan. Now, Japan has, and am I right, a traditional respect for education going back. And yet, there is a deficit that they feel. In fact, in the big discussion between 1868 and 1872, when the Code of Education comes in, there's a discussion, why is it that Americans are more productive than we Japanese are? And the answer that's given is because the Americans are more educated than we are. There began the enormous Japanese move to get the country fully educated within 40 years, which it succeeds. And there's a period when about, I think if my calculation is right, nearly 45% of the revenue of the local states were expended on primary education, which is higher figure than ever in the history of the world. They succeed in doing it. By 1910, Japan is publishing more books than any other country in the world. By 1913, more than twice as many books than any other country, including the United States. So that's the kind of laying apart which would be followed later by the Koreans after 1946, and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore. The so-called Asian model developed. It has connection with the Smithian thing about the importance of the state doing something, education being one. Now then think of another date, 1948, 2 great things happening. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is in some ways an intensification of democracy as well as integrating democracy with development, and it is the work of Eleanor Roosevelt, but it is a major global achievement. It's also the time when the National Health Service comes in, and the first health service hospital, I think, Anna and Bevan opens one in Manchester. So this is and that brings in what was done for education earlier, now for healthcare. And the European welfare state is born. Now, we can think of many other dates, but in just these dates, if we look back at the commitment that came there, there is a globality, there is a global relevance for every country, not just the country of origin of these ideas, and they're continued relevant. If I make a criticism of, say, my own country, India, It is to neglect not so much the first. I think on the Constitutional 17 article consultation we do have that, in the sense that there is a flourishing democracy. And indeed there's a long Buddhist tradition. There are some of the earliest Buddhist councils from 3rd century BC, actually from 6th century BC, shortly after Buddha's death, took place in India. So that's one respect we succeed, but on the economic development side, neglect of education, neglect of healthcare, neglect of recognizing how the state and the market economy can be integrated together, and neglect of some basic human rights, especially when it comes to backward castes and women and so on. So I think there's lessons from history as well as things that require us to be passionate today. And it's the combination of that passion and reason that I see as the central feature of the relation between history and development.
Terrific, Amartya. Thank you. I'm just going to ask each of you one more question now, because we'll be chatting at greater length during the public conversation this evening. And that is about the United Nations. Emma, you touched on this early in your remarks, and you sit on the board of the United Nations Foundation. When you think of the UN, how do you see its role, its potential, its limitations on development, in fact?
Well, first of all, I think in this 70th anniversary year, the United Nations itself is tremendously understudied as a historical subject. It's a wonderful subject for historians. I have a particular view on this because I've just finished teaching a semester-long undergraduate course at Harvard University called United Nations, A Global History, which tries to do the sort of history that historians do for national governments or social movements or regions or ideas, and apply it to the UN. And it's very striking to me how many wonderful subjects there are for historians, how many extraordinary sets of primary sources and archival sources there are to be used. And I think one really fascinating theme in this is actually about the idea of development. And over the 70 years of the UN, the ideas of development that people have held to and believed in have changed tremendously. There was an orthodoxy of planning in the early 1950s. There was a tremendous orthodoxy of anti-planning more recently. But take an idea that's extremely important to UNU, sustainability. Where did that idea come from? What does it mean to people? And this is not just a history of the few theorists, for example, in the Brundtland Commission who defined sustainable development, but of the thousands of people who are actually practitioners of development in UN agencies. How do national government delegations, including the delegations of tiny countries, participate in the emergence of these extraordinary and inspiring ideas? So I think if one does, in a sense, ordinary history of the UN, there really is a lot to be learned, and in fact, in a way, there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And I think by ordinary history, I mean a history which is one of the successes and also the failures, and there are many. I mean, I think at this point it's been a good year for the UN. It's ending on a quite optimistic note with the climate agreement and agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think knowledge of the past is a way for any organization, including UN agencies, including UN missions, to know more about what they are and how they can how they can do different things in the future. I mean, Amartya, who's almost a historian, an honorary historian. I was for many years honorary professor of history and economics, which was a strange thing to be since I was an economist many, many years ago. But he had lots of dates, and I don't think. I think part of the problem with the UN's history is that it's been too much about dates and major commemoration and less about the people who made the UN, who had conflicting ideas and disagreed about ideas and had extraordinary personal histories as they were developing this extraordinary idea of universal worldwide economic development. But I should just say one funny thing. We're talking today about history and development. I actually gave a series of lectures at the World Bank some years ago called History and Development. And the people there were extremely nice. But at the end of the first lecture, somebody came up and introduced himself and said he'd enjoyed the lecture, and it was particularly appreciated by us Nessies. So I said, who are Nessies? And for anyone who's British, Nessie has the connotation of the Loch Ness Monster, yeah. So it's not a sort of self-loving brief description. He said, oh, Nessies, don't you know? Non-economist social scientists. So there has been a presumption that social science and perhaps social science and humanities more generally is economics, and I think there's a very important role for history within UNU and within the UN system.
Terrific, thank you. And Amartya, your life has intersected so much with the UN, like Emma's.
It has, yeah, but I've had low expectations from the UN. It seems to me that the organizational structure is so frigid, and it reflected the reality at the end of the war, with the 5 permanent members who had emerged victorious from the Second World War. And then the General Assembly, where it can pass resolution. On the other hand, all the actions ultimately depend on the Security Council with the veto. So it seemed to me that if that was one thing and the one reason for, and with all due caution about dates, why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was worth commemorating, in my judgment, quite aside from the same period of the National Health Service and the welfare state, is because there was some globality there which wasn't parasitic on the institution. I think if one sees the United Nations as a general commitment, it's a commitment to reason about problems and adversities and cooperation. And the UN itself may provide some of that basis, but as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights indicates, we need many other institutions, many other commitments. And I think nothing came out so clearly as it did, as we saw with the climate discussion. After the disastrous failure of the Copenhagen, there was a limited success in Paris. On one side, it wasn't an attempt, as in Copenhagen, to have a strict set of limits, not based on general public discussion across the world, but basically thought up by clever Europeans and wanting the world to sign on. There was no chance in hell of that happening. There was much more realistic in the Paris climatic talk, and it wasn't a part of the UN resolution, but it was the general UN commitment. And yet, if you think about the neglect that remained, we can criticize that agreement. You see, I think the carbon danger is now well understood and overdue too. The global warming and all the problems that remain. The danger is that if that becomes our only concentration, we can miss out on other dangers. And one of them, I think, is nuclear. The World Bank actually, in its declaration of safe energy, declares solar, wind, wave, and nuclear as being safe energy. Now, this is a pretty doubtful proposition, not just because there could be accidents, as it happened in the technologically most sophisticated country, namely Japan, in Fukushima, but also there are problems of terrorism. If you drop a bomb on a nuclear power plant, with a certain probability, it can actually lead to catastrophe. If instead of happening what happened in Bombay Taj Hotel in November some years ago, if it had been only a small distance away in one of the nuclear plants like in Tarapur, that we'd be talking about 1 million casualties. Then there's the nuclear theft issue. Since I was in the board, and I still remain an honorary member of the board of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, set up by Ted Turner and Sam Nunn, very aware of the problem that comes. Think of a terrorist who has somehow managed to get hold of a nuclear possibility that could be exploded. Now, the more of these plants you have across the world, and I see this morning's paper that India is now going to have 6 more from Russia. Already they have quite a few. I think the possibility of exposure, theft, sabotage, and sheer vandalism, not to mention the big problem of nuclear waste material storage, remains very, very big indeed. I don't think that got enough discussion. And I think, like the one-eyed deer, there is a danger of being hit from the other side. And I think if the scientists have reason to grumble that the public hadn't been listening so much to the carbon story that they scientifically got, and they are right, but they have limited success now, I think the public could also grumble that, at least in my experience, coming from Cambridge Math, I find Harvard and MIT scientists, they're very well informed on the global climate thing, but actually underestimate the reason for the public's fear, afraid of being afraid of nuclear proliferation. And you know, there's a way of calculating, that's why even as a professional economist, going back to Bernoulli and others, we have to think about low probabilities and how that should affect our rational thinking. And large number of plants with similarly low probability can add up to a very large total. And I think especially sitting here in Japan, which is the only country which actually has suffered from being attacked on the nuclear thing. I'm not talking here only about nuclear bomb. That, of course, is a major worry, and especially in the subcontinent, in the South Asia. But even peaceful, meant to be peaceful, nuclear energy, I think that requires much, much more discussion than the system, either the UN system or the general public discussion has generated. So I think I see this as an engagement. It's an engagement of global democracy, which is not just global government, which is maybe well beyond our dream at the moment, but it's also a question of global discussion, decision through discussion, the John Stuart Mill idea. I think that remains in sheer deficit, and therefore to think of history, including what happened in the past, including nuclear use, not only in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the threat that it has remained hanging over the world in the Cold War period. I think these are very important things to think about and extend to the problems that come from the users of peaceful nuclear energy. Happily, solar energy is making much faster progress, growing about 30% per year now. And I think if instead of spending money on trying to make nuclear energy safe, which I don't think it would ever be, we want to spend more money in making solar energy. I mean, all that has been happening with very little actually subsidy from the government, often the opposite, the subsidizing fossil fuel, and still the solar energy is moving. I think a gigantic expansion of the renewable energy of a really safe kind, not the not the safety. We cannot distinguish between solar and nuclear. I think it's very, very important. So it's a good moment for us to ask, what does history tell us? How does development and security, big concern in Japan, human security, beginning with the Prime Minister Obuchi, that had been one of the things, and I was very privileged to work with Sadako Ogata, Madam Sadako Ogata and I co-chaired a Human Security Commission set up by the Japanese government. That is a very important thing from economically, socially, as well as from the point of view of survival and safety.
Great. Well, listen, thank you both so much. For our viewers, thank you for joining us online. I'm sure now you're sorry you won't be with us in Tokyo this evening for an extended conversation, primarily with the audience. But it's tremendously kind of you both to make the time for this this morning. Thank you and welcome back to UNU.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.